Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today, Thursday, May 11th, for a webinar titled Data Residency, Challenges and the Need for Standards. This is a joint presentation from the Object Management Group and the Cloud Standards Customer Council. Just for background, the OMG is an international software standards organization. The Cloud Standards Customer Council is a program under the umbrella and under the direction of the OMG that delivers best practice content on cloud standards and use cases to help influence standards development and spread the successful adoption of cloud computing. So our two organizations have conducted a study on data residency to analyze existing laws and regulations, to solicit input on the current and future impact of data residency on IT and cloud users and service providers, and also areas where standardization could help organizations like yours address these very real legal and regulatory issues. So today's webinar is going to introduce a paper that was written based on these findings, where we sought input from government and industry members across our mutual networks. So the paper is available today. It's titled Data Residency, Challenges and the Need for Standards. So my name, I'm Tracy Berardi. I am Senior Marketing Manager with the OMG. I am introducing today's speakers, and I'll be moderating the presentation. We're very happy to have you today, so thanks for joining us. So speaking today is Mr. Andrew Watson. He's Technical Director of the OMG, and Mr. Claud Budrow, Principal at Sebe IT and Knowledge Management, an active member and consultant to the OMG, and a leader on the steering committee of the Cloud Standards Customer Council. So Claude served as editor and led development of the data residency paper that we're discussing today. So we will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, and we'd love for you to submit comments. You can do that through the Comments tab on BrightTalk. And also I'd like to direct your attention to the Attachments and Links tab. We've gone ahead and uploaded a PDF of the presentation deck that you can download from today, as well as links to the OMG website and the Cloud Standards Customer Council website, where you can download the data residency paper in its entirety on which this presentation is based. So now I'm going to hand the presentation over to Mr. Andrew Watson, who will take a moment to tell us about the Object Management Group and some of this work. Andrew, it's over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Tracy, and hello, everybody. So just a few words to introduce Object Management Group, OMG, one of the organizations under whose auspices this paper was written. OMG is a standards organization, and we're one of the most successful forums for creating open integration standards in the computer industry. The specifications that we produce include middleware platforms such as DDS, the Data Distribution Service, a military-grade middleware, data-centric middleware that's widely used in marine and aviation applications, and increasingly in critical infrastructure like power generation to move data around the increasingly distributed systems that we're increasingly building within these applications. We also historically were known for our Corba middleware, which broke new ground back in the 90s as the first distributed object middleware, and still probably the only standardized distributed object middleware in the industry. We're also known for our work on modeling, which is perhaps more relevant to our work today. Our flagship modeling platform is UML, the Unified Modeling Language, almost certainly the most widely used standardized modeling language in the world, used in about 80% of software development shops to create blueprints for software. We also publish BPMN, the Business Process Model and Notation, very widely used for modeling business processes, SysML, a modeling language for systems engineers, and a number of other modeling specifications based upon these foundations. We do work in systems assurance, creating specifications for assuring the reliability, dependability, and conformance to specification of systems that we're building today, increasingly, of course, in mission-critical applications. Not just traditional mission-critical applications like power stations or chemical plants, but of course today increasingly in applications like the cars that we all drive. There are an increasing number of safety-critical computer systems embedded in those vehicles. And we do a number of vertical domain specifications in areas such as finance, healthcare, C4I, and others. Organizationally, we are a member-controlled industrial consortium, both owned and run by our members, and our members are both vendors and users in the various industries in which we operate. We are a not-for-profit organization, and our product is free. Our product is interoperability specifications, and they're freely available at the URL that you see on your slide now. And as Richard Stallman is fond of saying, that's free in both senses of the word, both in the sense of free speech and free beer. Free beer, they cost nothing, but perhaps more importantly, free speech, we do our best to ensure that you do not have to license any patents or copyrights in order to use OMG specifications. We also have a very good relationship with de jure standards organizations such as ISO, IEC, JTC1, and a number of OMG specifications, including UML, BPMN, and SysML, have been turned into de jure international standards under the auspices of ISO via that route. So just to give you an impression of who participates in OMG, this next slide is a cross-section of our membership, although not, I must stress, a complete list of our members. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you can see there are at least another 200 members. I couldn't fit on the slide and still have it at a font size that you could read. And if you're aware that your organization is an OMG member and you're not listed here, I do apologize. As I say, this is just intended to be a cross-section. To show you that we have representation from large software vendors, such as Microsoft, such as Oracle. We also have smaller software vendors, innovative software vendors like, for instance, Signavio and SoftTeam, as well as end users in the areas in which we're active. Companies like Bloomberg doing financial products, Boeing doing aerospace, Huawei doing telecoms products based, at least in some cases, on OMG specifications. We are also an international organization. About 50% of our membership is in North America, and about 50% is in the rest of the world, largely in Europe, but also in the Far East, South America, and Australia. So with that to OMG, I'm just going to hand you back to Tracy to tell you a little bit about CSCC. Tracy.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. And yeah, as part of my role with the OMG, I help to program manage the Cloud Standards Customer Council, and the CSCC is a member organization managed by the OMG that provides customer-led guidance to multiple cloud standards defining bodies and establishes the criteria for open standards-based cloud computing. So the CSCC is not a standards writing group, but we help to influence standards of practice in this space. And we do so by working with end-user organizations, standards bodies like the OMG, ISO, and others, as well as open source groups like Cloud Foundry, OpenStack, Hyperledger, and others. So we publish white papers and guides on key cloud computing topics, such as the paper we're talking about today on the various challenges and considerations involved with data residency, cloud security, service-level agreements, hybrid cloud computing, and multi-cloud management. These are all key topics under the purview of the CSCC. So I just wanted to make you aware that these resources, they're freely available on our website. It's cloud-council.org. The data residency paper is the most recently published, just published this month in May. It was the CSCC Security Working Group that collaborated with the OMG on the data residency discussion paper we're introducing today. So now, Claude, Mr. Budrow is going to take us through really the bulk of today's presentation. So over to you, Claude. Thanks.
Thank you, Tracy. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending where you are. We actually started this effort on the OMG side about 2 years ago now. We had an OMG member who business critically depended on the ability to collect data sets with provenance across countries, and who suggested to us that this was an area where OMG guidance would be useful. And Andrew and I sort of put our heads together and initiated with our meeting in Berlin in June 2015 a working group meeting that was actually fairly well attended by a combination of users and suppliers of various sorts of IT systems. And this meeting coincided with the first movements in the European Union to strengthen what has now become the global directive on the Global Data Protection Regulation, which alarmed a number of IT service providers, in particular American cloud providers at the time, about the risk of seeing restrictions on where data could be located if it pertained to European citizens in particular. So that gave us some extra reason to address this issue. And we had a succession of meetings that quickly converged on finding out what industry, government, and research institutes knew and thought about this. So what we did is we prepared a request for information, RFI, issued it, processed the responses, which came from a variety of types of organizations, although not that many, because we also discovered that people were reluctant to discuss it in case they would reveal some weakness in their compliance programs or in their technical approaches. So that was very instructive. And on the basis of that, we ran a couple of webinars a year ago. And then we started converging on what our first deliverable was, which is the paper that's already been mentioned a couple of times. So we started drafting the paper, and we enlisted our colleagues in the Cloud Standards Customer Council. And since I have a foot in both organizations, that was quite easy to do. And their security working group in particular took an interest in this. And so in the first quarter of this year, we had multiple people collaborating, contributing sections to the paper, which I edited. It was adopted by the OMG as an official deliverable at the meeting we had at the end of March in Washington, D.C., and then it was submitted to the CSCC's own editorial and review process, and that process concluded last week. So we now have a companion paper from the CSCC, and we're in the phase of doing press releases and this webinar, and that is going to be followed up by a tutorial at the OMG's meeting in Brussels in about a month, in 3 weeks now. So that's the history of the effort. So here's the cover pages of the two papers. They're different because the organizations have their own look and feel. Inside, the papers are the same, except that the early history of this effort, which is an appendix in the OMG paper, isn't really relevant to the CSCC paper, so it was removed. And also, the OMG is a standards development organization, an SDO, so there is a substantial section about a potential roadmap for standards in the OMG paper, and has been simplified and summarized in the CSCC paper, taking the standpoint not of the developers of standard, but of the potential users of standards. So the CSCC paper talks about the needs for standard, but not what the development process should be. The rest of the paper, 90% of it, is identical between the two versions. Those papers are about 35 pages each, and depending on your perspective, you can download one or the other, but apart from the differences I said, it really doesn't matter too much which one you use. Obviously, in all our efforts since the beginning, we had to start by telling people what we thought the definition and the scope of data residency is, and after putting an initial definition in the request for information, we've obviously tweaked that definition based on the feedback we got from the companies that responded to the RFI. Just like every early discipline, like was the case for IoT or cloud computing and may still be the case, there are a lot of different definitions floating around. Lots of organizations say, yeah, there is that definition, but I don't like it too much, so I'm going to make my own definition. So we maybe unfortunately followed the same trend, and we said that data residency is the set of issues and practices related to the location of data and metadata, and then the movement of these things across geographies and jurisdictions, and the protection against unintended access and other location-related risks. Unintended by the people who are the custodians of the data. It may not, obviously accessed by hackers or accessed by governments. It's sometimes perfectly intentional on the part of those entities, but the people who are charged with keeping that data do not intend the data to be accessible to certain people. However, the location of the data or the places where the data is transiting through may expose the data to unwanted access, and that's part of the issues, as well as some others we're going to see in a second. Some important words there: data and metadata, both are important. The fact that it's not just the static location, but it's also the movement of that data, and it's not always clear what constitutes residency in that case. And the other important distinction is geographies and jurisdictions. You have some jurisdictions that are smaller than a country in a federative organization like the United States, for instance. You could have a law in California. Actually, you do have a law in California that's more stringent than the federal laws. And then in other areas, it's the opposite. You have a supranational jurisdiction, such as the European Union and its GDPR regulation that imposes itself on the various member countries. In terms of scope, it's important to note that we're not just talking about the protection of personally identifiable information, such as health or financial data. We're also talking about other types of data, and I'm going to give some examples in a second, usually called sovereign data and some other. So we go into the papers into a taxonomy of the types of data that potentially pose a risk. There is a one-page table that details the types of data that are at risk, and then we have a list of these 13 points here, these 13 types of risks, with more text obviously in the paper detailing the kinds of risks. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to read all 13 issues here. Obviously, the point of this webinar is to introduce the paper, and if you want the details, you do need to go and download the papers and read them. But it's a variety of business and technical and legal risks. You could be simply found in violation of a government law. That was the case with LinkedIn in Russia. You could have unauthorized access by a foreign organization which finds access to your data because it is located in their country. You could have demands for access by the government. That's the case of the Microsoft versus FBI issue related to Office 365 accounts in Ireland, et cetera, et cetera. And you have the increased cost of doing business and the impediments to doing business if a law forces an IT service company to put a data center in a certain country or in a number of countries instead of being able to achieve economies of scale by centralizing or consolidating their infrastructure. So there is a variety of risks. And one of our members from a very large IT services company that I will not name actually wrote to me in an email during the RFI period. This could actually threaten the whole cloud industry's existence if the rules and the enforcement of data residency became even more stringent than it is today. So a variety of risks. Here's an example of migration to the cloud. So are you as an organization allowed to put your data in the cloud if it's going to be stored in another country? And you have examples of various countries where people take different approaches. This is often quoted to me. I do some work in Mexico. My clients there in the government often say, oh, I cannot put my data, I cannot do collaboration in Google Docs because it would be stored in the U.S. and the law says I can't. On the other hand, we have an example of a Danish bank which obtained a perfectly reasonable waiver from their regulatory authority to put data on a cloud server located in the UK. So we find all sorts of examples like that. A second example, which was pointed out to us by one of the members of our working group, is that in scientific research, very often large and complex data sets are being moved across countries in order to be aggregated to enable more data science. And in the area of genomics in particular, the data is supposed to be anonymized from the subjects, the individuals whose genome has been mapped. However, we all know that there are some re-identification methods that people have demonstrated. And so if the metadata somewhere still contains the names of the people whose genetic code was mapped, does that now violate data residency that a researcher is acquiring a few terabytes of such data from one country to another? Third example, with which I'm very familiar because I spent a number of years in the oil and gas industry myself, is the processing data on petroleum reserve, production data, exploration data, seismic data, which is extremely complex 3D or even 4D data. And in the U.S., we're used to major private companies doing this work, Exxon, Chevron, etc. But in many parts of the world, these are national companies that belong to the government, and the government says that data is a national asset. It's extremely sensitive. It cannot be exported. This is actually written into law, for instance, in Russia and in Venezuela, and I think also in Malaysia. So now you have this data is being captured by service companies, which are multinationals on contract to the local national company, and they're transmitting that data across their data centers in order to analyze it. Does that violate the law? One of the members of our working group even pointed out that if that data is being beamed from a seismic vessel to land, but the Earth station that captures the traffic is not in the country where the data is going to, does that represent temporary residency of that data in a third-party country, potentially in violation of the laws of the destination country? So it becomes extremely complicated, and I certainly know of an example of a company that was planning to install a remote operations center in only 3 places in the world, and ending up having to deploy 30 such instances instead of 3 because of the constraints of data residency. And a final example is law enforcement access to personal data, and here this is a paraphrase of 2 cases, one with Microsoft and one with Google, where the information pertaining to the person who's suspected of a crime is held on a server in a foreign country. Which law prevails? Can the FBI tell the company, give us those email records because that person is American, or because you are an American company? Or can the provider, as has been the case with both Microsoft and Google, say, sorry, that data is in Ireland, therefore it is subject to EU regulation, I cannot give it to you, and the cases are in front of the courts. So these are examples, and you don't have to read this eye chart here. It is in the paper, obviously, but we created a use case matrix that shows various combinations of locations of where does the data come from, where is it stored, where are the people, where is the application that actually looks at the data, and where is the end user who is sitting in front of that application screen and looking at the data, and where does the data traverse various countries where routers are located as the data moves from its storage location, from the source location to the storage location, and then from the storage location to the screen of the end user as it is processed. And you've got all sorts of potential combinations there of whether things are inside the premises of the company, outside those premises but within the same country, or crossing boundaries. And in that case, what are the situations that can happen with the usual color coding that green means fine, yellow means maybe a bit of a problem, orange means serious, and red means you've got a real potential here that you're doing something illegal. So that use case matrix doesn't cover all the potential cases here, because I think you'd have 3 to the power 6 different rows if you did that, but it covers the most egregious cases with a use case description in the left column. It's a very instructive set of case studies in this matrix. So what's the regulatory landscape about that? Well, unfortunately, it's extremely complicated. It is extremely contradictory. You have a multiplicity of laws and regulations that tend to be inconsistent, overlapping, still evolving. So even if you try to, as we did in the papers, put in an appendix that gives a fair number of examples of such laws and regulations, we point out very carefully in those sections of the papers that this is illustrative, but if you are going to do something serious based on that information, you actually need to find a source where that information is updated, because it may be varying on a monthly basis. Some countries have no such law or regulation, and some countries have extremely severe ones. And it is not entirely correlated with whether you have a high-tech country or a low-tech country. You have some countries that are developing countries that decided to take a very, very strict policy as a conservatory measure. It's like, okay, since we haven't yet necessarily studied all the implications, we're just going to say that you can't put any data outside of the country. That's certainly a simple solution, if a difficult one. And then you have regulations that are extremely long, extremely complex, like the European one, and some U.S. ones, and some from other countries. In some countries, those regulations about data residency apply mostly or only to government data. It says, okay, municipalities, states, provinces, and the central government cannot store their data, especially data concerning citizens outside of the country. And it says nothing about what private companies can do. It's not always true, so that is another dimension of the diversity of these laws. The GDPR from Europe, which was ratified last year, is one of the most comprehensive regulations. And then if you look at why these regulations exist, it's also instructive, because some of these regulations are well-intentioned. They're to protect the privacy of the citizens of a country. But obviously, the next sort of justification is safety and security and legality, so enabling police and law enforcement to track illegal or dangerous activity. It's also very often so that tax authorities can inspect companies' data in order to detect fiscal fraud. But then you have a lot of regulations that are aimed at forcing economic actors to set up shop in that country. So if you say data cannot be stored outside of the country, it's going to force companies to establish data servers and hire IT people inside your country. So it is often an anti-outsourcing motivation. And in some cases, it's even monetization of the flow of data, where some countries consider that the export of data and the re-import of that data, if it has been enhanced, constitute value added in the sense of being subject to value-added tax. And guess who determines the value of the data and therefore the amount of tax? The government. So then you have people who are led to negotiate with the government on that value and how much tax they're going to pay to compensate the government for the fact that the data goes out and comes back in and has been processed outside of the country rather than inside. The papers list the following countries. I mean, the countries that you can see on this slide. There's 20 listed here as having some specific regulations that are worth mentioning. But again, it doesn't mean there's only 20 countries in the world or 20 jurisdictions in the world that have such regulations. This is only a partial list. And some countries are more focused on financial data. Some countries are more focused on natural resources, like Venezuela and Russia. Some countries have a very comprehensive regulation, like the European Union. In Australia, it's mostly about health, data, etc. There's all sorts of situations. The paper gives you a glimpse of what these various situations are. Now, going from the problem to the solution side, what are the standards that could be relevant to helping with this? And the finding basically is that there are currently no standards that really specifically address, that are focused on addressing data residency issues. You have a number of standards to which data residency relates, and that sort of indirectly may help, but again, because they don't directly address data residency, they're less than satisfactory in their coverage of the issue. It's usually found in security and privacy standards, not surprisingly. So you have 3 special publications from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, in the USA. Their numbers are listed here, and they relate to privacy and security of the cloud in particular. And therefore, they do have an impact on best practices and governance for keeping data secure, including when it is placed in the cloud, which might be in another country. But typically of such standards, the sections that talk about securing and ensuring the privacy of data don't really make a distinction between whether that is in-country or across countries. So you are left to adapt what you read in those standards to the situation where data residency comes into play. Similarly, with the ISO IEC standards on information security, the 27001 and its companion 27002, which is about implementation. 27001 is about policies for information security. It's the successor to a long line of standards that started many years ago with British Standards 7799. And then you have the adaptations of 27001 to the cloud situation with 27017 and especially 18. Same thing, general consideration, and sometimes fairly specific ones about security and privacy, but you are left to infer what is the impact when you're crossing boundaries. The Cloud Security Alliance, CSA, which is, by the way, an organization with which the CSCC has a pretty good liaison and collaboration, has formed an International Standardizations Council, ISC, I think last year or the year before, and the ISC has realized that it's taking data residency as one of the issues they need to work on, but there isn't yet a product out of that effort in the domain we're considering today. There is a subcommittee of of Joint Technical Committee 1 of ISO IEC, which is also considering doing work on data residency. And actually, one of the members of our working group and one of the co-authors of the papers is working on that committee. And when she informed them of the work we were doing, they really asked to talk to us because they felt that these papers were going to help them. So we're happy to collaborate. And the OMG has a long history of being in liaison with ISO and actually submitting some of its work to the ISO for adoption along a fast path. So we're looking forward to potentially influencing and collaborating with the work of this ISO subcommittee. There is an association, a trade association of cloud providers in Europe, CSCC. They have published a voluntary data protection code that is relevant. Now, this is the vendor's standpoint or perspective, so it is obviously biased towards the vendors, but it's basically an attempt for these cloud providers to say, we will voluntarily do the following things so that governments don't have to impose regulations on us. So it's, let's offer to do some positive things so that, regulators who may not know that much about the technology suddenly pronounce laws that would be too constraining. This being said, I don't mean to be critical of the effort. It's actually a step in the right direction to have these voluntary guidelines. And then there is a certain number of standards, either existing or in progress, that may prove relevant. The OMG has an Information Exchange Framework, or IEF, which obviously we are talking here about information exchange. So, and that framework has some existing standards that have come out of it, like an information exchange policy vocabulary standard, and there's some other things being discussed right now. So we are actually in discussion with the owners of this effort to make sure that when they talk about policies and mechanisms for information exchange, that they think about data residency in the standard. There is an effort that comes from the military community on which the OMG's C4I task force, command control computers, communication and information, is working on a data tagging and labeling potential standard, and obviously tagging and labeling the data would be here a mechanism that could help with enforcing data residency. The EXACML standard, Extensible Access Control Markup Language, could also be a relevant way to mark up data with metadata about its rules for access across jurisdictions. So that could be an implementation mechanism. We haven't yet done a formal study of what it would take to use this standard in order to help resolve the data residency issue, but that's definitely on our roadmap to do that. And there is an effort which is mostly at the stage of academic research papers on an open digital rights language, ODRL, which again could have relevance. So there are some things that have been done in that area, but they need a substantial amount of work to be transformed into something that could help an end-user organization actually encode and manage data residency information. So the people who responded to our request for information and who worked on the paper converged on a certain number of things that are needed at this point. First, more documentation and education about the issue. Our papers and this webinar and the presentation we're going to give in Brussels next month are obviously a good start in the direction of educating people about the issue. Cataloging the laws and regulations is very helpful in practice to the compliance departments of various organizations. There is a European Center for International Political Economy, SEP. They've actually published now online a digital trade database. It doesn't strictly talk about data residency. It talks about any trade regulations that could impede trade, but that includes mention of data residency. The link to go to that database is included in the paper. It's work in progress. It only got opened about 3 months ago, but it is very promising as a living catalog of regulations. And then there's two areas where we see the potential to formalize descriptions through some language similar to the modeling languages that the OMG has 25 years of experience defining. So one would be a formal description of the laws and the regulations because they're written in natural languages, which is ambiguous. So if we could have some sort of formal rules language maybe inspired by some other rules language we already have, like object constraint language or another standard called SBVR, which is an OMG standard. We could potentially formalize the description of the laws and the regulations. And then if we could formally describe the content of the data, or at least the sensitivity of the data, then if you combine these two things, you might be able to better manage the residency. You might be able to have a tool that reads the metadata and says, oh, this data is being sent to Ireland. The formal definition of data residency in the European Union and the formal definition of the content of this data set are in conflict, and that data shouldn't go there, and therefore the transfer is blocked. This is an ideal pie-in-the-sky, perhaps a bit utopian view of things, but that's the direction we want to at least seriously examine. Can we reach the point where formalizing through a standards the description of the content of the data and the regulations through a formal language, would that allow us to go towards automating the implementation of the restrictions? And we're facing challenges in doing that. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, there is a reluctance from some organizations to participate because participation is essentially an admission that there is an issue, and some companies are still in the mode of maybe it's a bit of an ostrich in the sand position too, but they'd rather not expose to the general public the fact that there is an issue, and working on this topic with us might constitute such an admission. And then if we do find a way to implement this, it's going to be fairly disruptive to the fabric of IT systems and of the network. It might at some point be in the form of new middleware that gets to be installed on every network router in the world. That is not something you can do lightly. It would be a disruption similar to the transition from IPv4 to IPv6 in computer networks. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tracy to lead us to the conclusion and towards the question period. Tracy?
Thank you, Claude. You know, as Claude described, data residency is obviously a serious challenge for both suppliers as well as users. And it may get worse before it gets better. And here at the OMG, we're looking seriously into standards that may help. And this is just one step closer to some solutions. So if you would like to get involved, please visit, I'm going to go to the next slide here just briefly so you can see. Please visit the OMG's website. It's omg.org/data-residency. Here is where you can download the paper titled Data Residency Challenges and the Need for Standards. You'll see it right there. Also on this page, Claude mentioned we're hosting a tutorial. It's in Brussels. It's on Thursday, June 8th. This is part of the OMG's technical meeting week. The OMG hosts one of these meeting weeks once per quarter, so 4 times per year. So the next meeting, it's June 5th to 9th in Brussels, and we'll host a tutorial on this subject on that Thursday. It's a free event. If you can make it, we would love to have you. Also on this page, you see cloud-council.org/resource hub. This is where the CSCC edition of the paper is located. So on either of these pages, you know, the OMG site is where you can sign up to join the working group we have running through OMG on data residency. There's a mailing list. In that mailing list sign-up form, you can indicate if you'd like to get more actively involved here. We welcome you to do so. On the cloud side, we have various working groups, and it would be the security working group that participates in efforts like these. So you're welcome, you know, to get involved with either or both organizations. So we have some time for Q&A, about 15 minutes, which is perfect. We have a few questions that came in. If you have some you've been thinking about, now's a great time to input them into Bright Talk, the questions tab. Let's get started. First question here says, on slide 18, I'm just going to bring us back to slide 18 real quick because it's right here. There we go. On slide 18, you mentioned that if we had 2 things we could better manage data residency. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, this is Claud. I'll take that one. So I tried to allude to that a little bit, but what we envisioned, and first of all, caveat, we've been focusing so much on creating this deliverable that the discussions about the implementation mechanisms have been very preliminary, just to make sure that we weren't completely thinking about crazy things. So when we had working group meetings, we were sort of in the what-if mode of discussion. What if we did that? Would that make sense? And everyone sort of nodded vertically. So we said, okay, that makes enough sense that we're going to mention this as the right direction. But we basically intend to have a discussion. It will also be in Brussels, but a couple of days before the tutorial, we're going to have a working group meeting, and we're going to start thinking about this a bit more seriously. So the idea is the following. Suppose every set of data has an accompanying metadata file that is a formal language, probably XML-based, that says, okay, here's the type of data that's in there. These are the levels of sensitivity, confidentiality. So we'd have to have a sort of taxonomy of the levels of seriousness that improper divulgation of that data could represent, etc. So we'd have to sort of invent that and put it in a format that maybe would be part of this data tagging and labeling effort that the OMG has, or maybe the information exchange facility. And if we had a repository that might be sort of an online ontology or something like that of all the laws and regulations in the world that touch on data residency, then various tools, whether it would be a browser plugin, whether it would be a module in a data management, a document management application, or maybe even in the operating system of a network piece of equipment, like a network router, could, as the data passes through, or as someone issues a command to send the data, to read the data, a URL request to display the data, etc., could intercept the data, read the metadata about the sensitivity of the data, read the description of the laws and regulations pertaining to the destination location of the data, and then calculate formally whether yay or nay the data can go there, and then if no, block the transfer. That's the idea. It's easier said than done. As I mentioned, there are huge implications in terms of feasibility, and even defining those languages and making this a good enough process so that it doesn't give you too many false positives or false negatives, doesn't block transfer that should be allowed, and doesn't allow transfer that shouldn't. That's a huge challenge, but that's the kind of things that the OMG has made a living solving in some cases, and so that is a potential direction we can examine. As I said, the landscape is not completely empty. There are some standards or beginnings of standards like IEF and data tagging and labeling and etc. that already can help with this some, or the XACML, XACML standards. So that's what I meant by the combination of these two particular bullets, enabling us to manage data better. And if you have ideas about that, please, by all means, contact us, get on our mailing list, and let us know what you think and how potentially you could contribute in our working group to defining that roadmap.
Great. Thank you, Claude. The next question is the OMG lobbying to get laws changed? Andrew, maybe that's a good question for you.
Yes, I'm happy to take that. The short answer is no. OMG is an engineering organization. Our job is to provide an understanding of technical problems and hopefully a solution, standard specifications that address technical problems. So no, we are certainly not lobbying to have laws changed internationally on this. It would be great if this paper informs a discussion of legislation in this area. We'd be very happy to brief anybody who's interested in learning more about the problems in this area, after we've done so much work to research it. And I think a certain amount of the work that's been done here by Claud and others, but a lot of kudos to Claud, is unique and original. So I suspect there are probably few other people who have such a broad overview of the scope of data residency regulations as we do at the moment. So we would certainly be happy to communicate that knowledge to those who are interested in making legislation in this area, but we are certainly not ourselves lobbying to change legislation. What we do aim to do is to provide, or it's perhaps too early to speak of this yet, we've surveyed the environment. I think there is scope for us to provide specifications. Probably, as Claude has mentioned, they would be metadata-based specifications to help internet providers and others comply with the regulations and comply with the different regulations in different countries. But no, we are certainly not ourselves lobbying to change any of those regulations. And actually, coming on from that, I think there is, I see in the queue, but I think it's basically a related question about the W3C P3P effort. And I'll take a swag at this, and then Claude, have you got anything to add? The question is this similar to the past W3C P3P effort? Can learnings from that help this? There are similarities. P3P is basically another metadata scheme, a way of labeling data. In that case, the objective of the labeling was to communicate a user's privacy preferences back to a provider of, say, a website or whatever. Whereas in this case, of course, we're labeling the data not to, with respect to an individual's privacy preferences, but with in relation to the legislative environment of the country in which the user finds himself. So in P3P, you're trying to communicate what each individual user wanted to express about their personal privacy preferences, whereas in data residency, we have to essentially encode the laws, the regulations of the place where the user is, and use that encoding to influence the way the data is distributed and stored and so on. But there is a similarity in that in both cases we are talking about labeling data, probably data from or about individuals, so that the data can be handled differently depending on that metadata labeling. Claude, I'm sure you have something to add to that.
Yeah, just a slight, not correction, but slight change to the way you describe P3P, because I mean P3P, the focus is really for a website to describe from a privacy perspective what it can do with the data. So what is the privacy policy of the website? And the idea is the website would offer in a formal language what it intends to do with the data, such as, for instance, if you capture a credit card number, what are we going to do with it? Are we going to store it or not store it? If you give us your phone number, will we share it with partner companies, etc. So that's what the P3P language is about. And then the implementation of the decision that an end user can make based on that policy, for instance, to not visit that site or to log out of it instead of continuing their transaction, that would be left to an agent piece of software that would be a plugin to someone's browser. So my browser could have a privacy plugin that reads the P3P information and tells me, whoa, Claude, you don't want to go to that site because they resell your information to others. The effort dates back to 10 years ago, 2007, And they actually had to slow down their effort at some point and suspend the work on an initial version because there was insufficient support from the implementers. And then they made changes, and they claimed that they were ready for implementation, but they never really gained as much traction as was hoped. So it is a slightly different purpose. It is something that we ought to look at, though, because some of the general ideas about how things are encoded to represent a policy might be useful. The standard actually does refer to the XACML, XACML standard. So I'm glad the question was asked. That's a very constructive question, and as we continue to discuss the roadmap, I'm going to include P3P in the list of things we look at to maybe form the backbone of our direction. So thank you.
But actually, Claude, time is passing. It was longer ago than that. Mozilla was considering removing P3P support from its browser in 2004. So P3P was effectively dead even, 13 years ago.
Yeah, okay. That was P3P version 3. It's the 3.1.1 or something like that was an improvement in 2007 that people were reluctant to implement.
Okay.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more. We'll sneak this one in. There's two, but I'll pick this one. And the other we could address too offline. I understand that people in Russia cannot access LinkedIn anymore. This had come up in a previous presentation. Is this a data residency issue?
Yes, it is. This is Claude here again, and I've been very much involved in this. I don't want to say I play a big role, but I do manage actually a professional group that has 1,200 people in Russia, and out of a total of 36,000, and they've been cut off since November 17. So it is a data residency issue in the sense that the law that LinkedIn violated is a law that says that such data needs to be held inside Russia, and LinkedIn has refused to comply. Now, so they're playing a hardball game with the Russian government right now, and we are going to see who wins. I have a prediction on that, but I will keep it to myself. The problem is, of course, what is the motivation? And as you can imagine, a certain number of people suspect that Russia wants the activities of its citizens, including what posts they make on LinkedIn, what status they update, the name of the companies they work for, especially if they're foreign companies, etc., to be something that they have an easier time accessing because it's stored inside Russia. So they don't want that data to be put outside of the country where they might have more trouble accessing it. That's the suspicion. I'm not making a political statement here, just reflecting the opinions I've heard. So the law is a data residency law. The motivations of the law are up to you to decide which ones you believe. But yes, it is such an issue, and it is being discussed between the commission on the appropriate commission of the Russian Federative Government, and it is not clear what's going to happen.
Thank you, Claude. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everybody who was able to join us today. Again, real quick, in the attachments tab, if you want to grab a PDF of the presentation, there are links to the papers. Also, right after this, this webcast will be archived on Bright Talk, so you're welcome to view it again on demand and share with others who would be interested in this topic and getting involved in this initiative, whether through the OMG's Data Residency Working Group or also the Cloud Standards Customer Council. So thanks again, and have a great rest of the day. We'll end now. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.